My name is Megan Phillips, and I am one of the co-founders of the Train with Trust project, here with Jody Ambrose, who is the other co-founder of the Train with Trust project. And we are joined once again by Dr. Sue Dyson, who is gracious enough to join us every month to discuss horse equine welfare and equine subjects related to the 24 behaviors of the ridden horse in pain, or the RHpE checklist, and related to a film that came out a few years ago that is still available for free on YouTube. So if you haven't seen that, the 24 behaviors of the ridden horse in pain, shifting the paradigm of how we see lameness, be sure to check that out. Today we are going to take on a subject that has a very broad perspective potentially, so we've tried to narrow in on it. I'm going to go ahead and be in the background, so if you have any questions that you'd like to pose for Dr. Dyson or Jody to answer, you can post those in the comments here, and we'll try to answer those during the live, or if not, we'll follow up with you in comments on this Facebook event here. And you can, if you're watching a little bit later, you can post those comments on YouTube. We try to check those fairly regularly to get back to you, and you can always contact us via our websites. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen because we'll have a PowerPoint that we'll be looking at here. So bear with me for just a moment while I get that pulled up, and then I will turn things over to Jody and Dr. Dyson to get things started. Pull this up here. Always takes longer than you want it to. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and pop into the background. Let us know if you have questions, and I'll check in with you guys after we're finished.
Okay, so today we're going to be talking about how to make purchasing decisions when you are considering equine products. And as Megan mentioned, this is a really broad topic because there are so many products and so many choices and so much information floating around about about what's the best thing. And all of us want to do best for our horses. And so we're trying to make good decisions. And also, it's an undeniable fact that it's a really expensive hobby or profession. And so it's becoming more and more important all the time that we are discerning about how we spend our money while still prioritizing our horses' welfare and making the best decisions for their well-being. Being an equestrian of a certain age, I can think back to when I started many years ago, and there weren't nearly as many choices. And I think we made our decisions mostly based on word of mouth, and I would say mostly from advice coming from our professionals or paraprofessionals, our trainers, our vets, our farriers, our body workers, those kinds of people. And I think that's still a really huge influence in how people make their buying decisions. But those people are bombarded with a ton of information and a ton of new products in a way that didn't used to happen. And used to be you had your equipment and you kept it until it wore out and then you replaced it. And now you might have a dozen different kinds of bits or 10 different girths, and being able to choose what works best and not buy things that you don't need and not buy things that aren't going to work. And that extends to all kinds of products. And we are going to focus in on some specific products, not because they're the most important or most clear examples, but because we don't have time to cover all of them. And I think we're really going to talk about the methodology of figuring out how to make an informed decision that you can apply to any situation. So we're going to, Sue's going to just basically talk through a slideshow covering these concepts. And if you have questions about specific things at the end, like Megan said, be sure to put them in the comments so that we can either address them now or we can get back to you after we're done today. So, Sue, I know you, like myself, have been equestrian for many years, and so you've, you're familiar with making these decisions as a consumer, but you're also someone who has done research and understands the methodology behind marketing these products because you know what goes into that. I'm going to just hand it over to you to talk about your thoughts on that and what tools you think people need and can use to feel like they're an informed consumer.
So I think it's a bit like buying a horse. The vendor wants to sell and the purchaser wants to buy. And therefore you have to ask yourself, well, why do you want the product? What do you want it to do? What are the manufacturer's claims about the product? Are those evidence-based or are they just pulled out of a hat to make the product look good? And have you asked for advice, and from whom have you asked advice, and how potentially reliable is that advice? And it's not always easy. I was trying to purchase a seat saver this week, and they ranged in price from £32, next one was £57, and next one was £79, and trying to find out the difference in, or were there in fact any differences between these products, was extraordinarily difficult. Although the wording describing these products tended to be more effusive about the more expensive product, but whether or not that was based on any effectiveness of the product is really open to question. So let's go to the next slide, please. So we see things like, if you look at websites, and this is where I've taken quite a lot of information, they say things like, we've done research. The product is tried and tested. But the question is, where's the methodology behind their research and where are the results? Because in many of these instances, there is nothing presented on the website to support the fact that they've done any research and whether or not the results supported the claims they're making for the product. And then we have to differentiate between research which has undergone a peer review process, so it's been published in a scientific journal, so the methodology has been critiqued by experts and the results also made sure that they're correct, versus it's just in-house testing. And we're going to give some examples of both peer-reviewed research and in-house testing and look how those tests vary. And I think that it's also important that you realise that when we're talking about products today, we're not endorsing any particular product, nor are we trying to denigrate any product. We're just trying to give you guidelines about how you should think. And then, of course, there's customer recommendations. When you look at websites, increasingly there are customised recommendations. So for these ride stirrups, Becky Moody, one of the top dressage riders in the UK at the moment, said, "For me, I feel they have helped me keep my lower leg more under me and I have more stability while still maintaining good effectiveness with my leg." But Becky is somebody that I personally would trust. But if it was from somebody else that you didn't know, I don't know how trustworthy the statement would be. And then we always have to remember that many times the upper level riders are being sponsored by the product manufacturers, and this may influence to some extent what they say. There's an element of bias. So let's go to the next slide. And now we're going to discuss specifically half pads. And I'm going to tell you about some quotes that are from a variety of different products. The pressure on your horse's back when taking off and landing during jumping is significantly reduced. There was no evidence to support that, and I know of no study that has looked at that. The next is you, the rider, will suffer from much less back and neck pain after training sessions or competitions. Again, not supported by any factual evidence. The memory foam pad gives way under pressure and then springs back to its starting position, so extremely shock absorbing and flexible. No evidence to support that. And let's go to the next slide. These materials help to enhance the weight-bearing areas, which relieves pressure on the wither and spine. It's got merino wool and air technology. That's a strange statement to take for me, in that there should not be pressure on the wither and spine. The design of any pad should be that it sits off the dorsal midline of the horse's back. Ultimate comfort and shock absorption, natural cushioning, and helps reduce pressure points for your horse's back, promotes airflow while enhancing saddle fit and stability. These are all very worthy claims, but they're not supported by any science or any in-house product testing that is presented. This half pad offers a contoured, pressure-free fit, natural cushioning. And then finally, the gel pad is both anti-slip and shock absorbing. So let's look at what the studies that have been done scientifically show us. Next slide, please. There's a study done by Russell McKechnie-Guire, Mark Fisher, who's a Society of Master Saddlers saddle fitter, and Thilo Fowl, a research scientist. And they looked at the use of a control cotton saddlecloth combined with wool-flocked dressage saddles, which were fitted to industry standards by Mark Fisher. And they tested the difference between the control, just the cotton saddlecloth, or combined with a gel pad, a wool pad, or a foam pad, all of which were new. They hadn't been used before. And the horses were tested. There were 12 horses and 12 riders, with the horses being ridden in sitting trot and canter in a 3-point position. They were evaluated in straight lines with 3 repeats on each of the left and the right reins. And there was a pliance horse mat underneath the pads and saddle, so that the pressures applied to the horse's back could be evaluated objectively. So this was a single intervention study, so the long-term effect of the use of any of these different half pads was not evaluated. If we look at the next slide, this is a graphic representation of some of the results. And these are the peak pressures measured under the front and back areas of the saddle while trotting and cantering. And the green represents the control, the pink represents the gel pad, the purple represents the wool pad, and the blue represents the foam pad. And these are the measures of the peak pressure. So if you look at the box tells you what the middle 50% of the horse's peak pressures were, and the lines extending up and down from the box are the degree of variability among the 12 horses. And we can see that those bars, those straight lines above and below, are pretty variable, particularly under the front of the saddle. So the boxes on the far left are under the front of the saddle in trot. The next boxes along are under the front of the saddle in canter, and then to the right we have under the back of the saddle in trot and under the back of the saddle in canter. And we can see there's much more variability in the results in the trot and the canter under the front of the saddle compared with the back of the saddle. And because we can see the long lines extending up and down from each box, we know there's a huge amount of variability between each of the 12 riders, particularly under the front of the saddle. And if we look at the front of the saddle and the different pads, the peak pressure underneath the saddle, underneath the front of the saddle, was greater significantly for the gel pad than for any of the other setups. The only other difference between the different pads was a non-significant trend for the foam and wool pads to have slightly lower peak pressures under the back of the saddle compared with the control setup and the gel pad setup. So basically, they couldn't see any substantial differences between the gel pad, the wool pad, and the foam pad compared with the control. Now they were measuring the peak pressures, and we have to ask, is the peak pressure or the average pressure the most important? And I don't think we have the answer to that. But basically, there didn't seem to be much difference between each of the individual setups. Let's look at a different study, and this is a different study that was performed in Switzerland. So we'll go to the next slide. And in this experimental design, they did it a little bit differently. So they took 8 non-lame warm blood horses, and each of those horses was ridden by a single rider. So you're minimizing the effect of different riders. So each horse was ridden in 6 different pads in a randomized order. And once again, the Pliant system was used to measure the pressures under the saddle. And each horse was ridden in its own well-fitting dressage saddle. And measurements were again acquired with the horse moving in straight lines. And measurements were acquired with the horse standing still at walk, sitting trot, rising trot, and canter. And if we go to the next slide, we can see the test setup. So in the bottom right, we can see the control thin quilted cotton pad, on top of which was placed either the gel pad, the Teco air shock absorber, the lambskin pad, or the Winderin multi-layered pad. On the bottom left, you can see a much larger body move pad, which was made of foam and cotton, and this was not placed over the cotton quilted pad on the bottom right. It was placed alone. So let's look at some of the results on the next slide. And again, we've got some graphs. And this is the mean pressure under the saddle. And we are looking at the horse standing still in red, the horse walking in the light green, the horse trotting in the dark green, the horse that's in sitting trot, the horse in rising trot in the blue, and the horse in canter in the purple. And you've got, we're measuring the mean pressures and comparing them with the control. And in this study, differences were observed comparing the Equine pad, the body move pad, the Mats pad, and the Winderin pad compared with the control. There was no significant difference for the gel pad compared with the control. So in all gaits, the mean pressure under the saddle was lower for the Equine, body move, Mats, and Winderin, and the same applied in canter, which the canter was lower than the control walk. Let's go to the next slide. So this is again showing that there are differences. So those with the superscript A, this is the highest mean pressure. Before the previous slide showed the mean pressure. Now we're looking at the highest mean pressure that measured with any of the different pads. And we saw that the highest mean pressure was no different between the Body Move, the Mats and the Wanderin, but was different between the Equine and the control. So for all of those measured with A as a superscript, they were all lower than the control. B was different to A, but lower than the control. There was no difference once again between the gel pad and the control. So the gel pad does not seem to be absorbing any of the pressure. Let's move to the next slide, which looks at what we call the center of pressure. And if the center of pressure moves a lot, that tells us that the saddle is relatively unstable. And I've highlighted using yellow rectangles where there was an alteration or an increase in that's being outlined there with the black arrows. These are showing where there is an increase in movement of the saddle compared with the control. So this was the case for the Body Move, the Mats and the Wanderin saddles. So there was more movement from front to back of the center of pressure for those. And then for the Wanderin pad, there was also more movement from side to side compared with the control. So the saddle was less stable as a result of the pads. And let's go to the next slide. The Wanderin half pad is an interesting innovation. It's nice to see innovations because it's made up of several different layers. And one of the layers is a synthetic biomechanical tissue, which is supposed to protect the muscles under the pad to reduce the forces acting on the muscles along the horse's back and to facilitate their loosening and development. And we know that less pressure enables horses to move better through their backs. Let's go to the next slide. Because this is going to describe, on the next slide, some mechanical testing that they did. One of the materials that they used, they claim is very good at absorbing kinetic energy. So therefore it acts potentially better as a shock absorber. So they did some in-house mechanical testing comparing the amount of absorbed energy. And they were able to demonstrate that their pad, using this mechanical test, absorbed 323 joules compared to the sheepskin pad absorbing 90 joules and the gel pad absorbing only 63 joules. Let's go to the next slide, which demonstrates what they were actually doing. They were dropping a known weight from a known height onto the pads and then measuring the absorbed energy. And we can see in the bottom right that the absorbed energy is indicated by the blue in the graph, and it's substantially more than the red in the graph, and substantially more than the orange in the graph. So the orange is the sheepskin pad and the red is the gel pad. So this looks like pretty interesting information, but of course it doesn't relate to the study that was done by Dittmann et al. In Switzerland, who did not show that there was a difference between the sheepskin pad and the Wanderin back pad when actually put on horses. Let's go to the next slide. And then we have this conflict that the study done by McKechnie-Guire did not show any difference between the pads, whereas the study done by Dittman and co-workers did show a difference between the pads. So how can we rationalize these results? Well, I think we have to think about the methodology of the testing. In McKechnie-Guire's study, they had 12 different riders. And obviously there's going to be an effect of the rider. The pressures measured underneath the saddle and the number are related to the interaction between the rider, the saddle, the pads, and the horse. And we saw a lot of variation between the riders, particularly in trot in the McKechnie-Guire study. So that individual variation among the riders may have been sufficient to obscure any differences between the pads. Whereas the only variable in the study done in Switzerland by Dittman et al. Was the change in the rider. We also don't know if there are any difference in the thickness of the pads, but I think that's less significant in terms of trying to interpret these results than the study design of using multiple riders versus one rider. We also have to ask, how are the horses actually performing? How did the horses feel? And that was not evaluated. They didn't look at the behavior of the horses. They didn't look at gait characteristics. So we don't know how the horses were actually performing. Nor do we know how repeatable those results were if we were to do these experiments several times over at, say, monthly intervals, and the pads were being used on a regular basis. How would this change the results? We don't know. So what is the longevity of these pads in terms of their effectiveness, if they are indeed effective? And what might the differences be if we were to evaluate the pressures during jumping? Because we know during jumping there's substantially increased pressure underneath the front of the saddle. So at the end of the day, I think we're still left with lots of questions. But those questions are important because if you look at the price differentials between a variety of different half pads, they vary. This was a month ago when I put this together, between £20, that's $27 or 23 euros, and £228, that's $305 or 260 euros. So they're very substantial differences, which is why I think we have to be questioning what is value for money and are manufacturers' claims actually valid? I think that there were a lot of claims that I read out to you initially that have no scientific validity whatsoever. So it's a question of buyer beware. I think if you go to the next slide, that it's also important to be aware of how any pad or cloth underneath the saddle interacts with the saddle. So in the photograph on the right, we can see a saddle with a full pad underneath it, and the back of the saddle is directly over the seam on the back of the pad. And on the left, you see this horse's back, and you can see to the left and the right of the midline, there is discoloured hair and what are effectively raised patches. And those raised patches were incredibly sore. And this is the effect of that piping being abrasive to the horse's back. So it's really, really important that when we put anything underneath the saddle, that it's going to be something that does no harm. Because this saddle and pad combination was doing this horse harm. So when you're using a pad, you need to also be asking yourself, why am I using this pad? What do I want this pad to actually do? Okay, we're going to change tack now. And on a slightly more positive note, I think, talk about commercial feed mixes. And commercial feed mixes, I think, by and large, are good in that the reputable brands, and this is Spillers, which is a big brand in the UK, is that they list all their products. They will certainly make claims. So for this type of food, horse and pony cubes, for optimum vitality, they have stated cereals contain starch, which is digested relatively quickly by the horse, producing what is known as quick release energy. And this may encourage excitability. And so they're claiming for this product that there are controlled levels of cereal starch and good levels of fiber to help reduce the risk of overexcitability. And they've also added there are now benefits from the addition of magnesium, known for its calming properties. The evidence with respect to magnesium is limited. There is some low-grade scientific evidence, but it is somewhat limited. But the good thing about these products, let's go to the next slide, is that they do list the ingredients and the proportions of the ingredients. And that's an important thing to be aware of whenever you're feeding. So if you're feeding one of these commercial mixes or cubes, they generally are very well balanced. And what they say on the packet is what you get. We're now going to talk a little bit about joint supplements, and this is a rather different field. And I'm going to show you slides with lots of pictures because there are lots and lots of different joint support supplements out there, which are a bit of a minefield with respect to which is potentially the best. And my question would be, do you need one to start off with? And what are you going to be paying for it? So let's look at some of the claims for these supplements. So it's important to note that the pictures of the different supplements do not relate to what I'm quoting on the left. So one claim, an unbeatable joint combination at an unbeatable price. Another claim, feed at maintenance rate to help support the joints of healthy horses. Well, my question would be, is there any evidence that healthy joints need support? And is there any evidence that anything we give to a horse, either by mouth or by injection, either into the body of the horse or into the joint, actually helps the health of a joint in a healthy horse? What sets product XX apart is the research-backed levels of glucosamine hydrochloride and chondroitin sulfate. Studies on horses with moderately severe osteoarthritis have utilized virtually identical ratios and quantities of these ingredients found in XX. Well, if you do a study, a search, I should say, for studies on horses with osteoarthritis, which have looked at the effect of joint supplements, I'm not sure you're going to find one, unfortunately. Or if you do, it will be based on a very small number of horses with very limited follow-up. Product YY is used in periods where you may anticipate greater need to prevent the horse from having too much impact upon the joint capital, such as increased workload, harder ground, or competition season. It doesn't really make a huge amount of sense as written, but that's what was the product was advertised as. I don't see how anything given orally can prevent the horse having too much impact on a joint, which was related to work intensity or hard ground. So let's go on to the next slide, please. So the questions that we need to be asking when we're looking at a joint supplement is, what does each contain? What are the ingredients? We've learned about glucosamine hydrochloride. We've learned about chondroitin sulfate. But are there fish oils? What else is in there? And what is the bioavailability of the ingredients? Now, we know that some ingredients are well absorbed by horses, but others are not. And that's an important thing in terms of how much is actually available that gets into the horse's system to have any biological effect. And then we have to say, what is the proven efficacy of any of the ingredients in horses? It's all very well studying people, for example, but the absorptive capacity of people is different to that of horses for some of the ingredients. I've already mentioned the fact that I would question whether or not there is any known benefit to healthy joints. And then we have to ask, are any of the claims actually backed by research? So I'm going to describe briefly a few studies which have looked at the efficacy or otherwise in clinical settings. So let's go to the next slide. And this was a study which evaluated 20 mature stock type horses. Now, they described them as non-lame. I would question whether just going out and selecting 20 horses, you're likely to get 20 non-lame horses. I suspect that you won't. But be that as it may, they were randomly assigned to either receive a joint supplement or a placebo. So that was a powder that was very similar in appearance, but didn't have any of the active ingredients in the supplement. And the supplement contained glucosamine, chondroitin sulfate, hyaluronic acid, MSM, that's methyl sulfonyl methane, turmeric, resveratrol, collagen, silica, and boron. Some of these have been tested in people and have been shown to have some potential beneficial effect. These horses were on a 28-day trial, and they underwent a kinematic objective gait analysis before starting the trial, after 14 days, and after 28 days. And during the study period, the horses were kept in group housing. They were turned out for two hours a day. They had light exercise, which comprised 4 sessions of 45 minutes at walk and trot. And in this study, they were not able to see any significant difference in the gait of those horses which were receiving the supplement compared with those that received the placebo. So no efficacy was demonstrated for this product. Let's go to the next slide, please. So this was a study that was done in Holland, and they took 24 old horses. So these were stiff horses, and they were had an age ranging, the average age was 29 plus or minus 4 years. And these horses were graded as being less than 1 out of 5 lame. That is barely detectably lame, effectively. However, they were stiff. And they either received a supplement which contained glucosamine, chondroitin sulfate, and methyl sulfonyl methane, that's MSM, or they received a placebo. And there were equal numbers of horses in the 2 groups. They were treated for 3 months. They had daily turnout, but being elderly horses, they were not in work. But they had their gait evaluated objectively while moving on a treadmill at a fixed speed. And they looked at various stride parameters, the stride length and the degree of carpal and tarsal flexion, that's knee flexion and hock flexion, and the extension of all 4 fetlocks. And they were not able to see any difference between the control group and the group receiving the supplement. in actual fact, the control horses had increased carpal flexion and increased fetlock extension at the end of the study compared to the beginning, which is a little bit curious, and I don't think we really have any explanation for that. Let's go to the third study, and this was a study conducted in the United Kingdom, and they had 24 mature horses of variable age, and they had up to a grade 2 out of 5 lameness. And they either were fed supplement S, which actually was Science Supplements Flexibility, which contains chondroitin sulfate, glucosamine, vitamin C, MSM, and some other things, DHA, EPA, or they received a placebo. And these were given to the horses in feed for 3 weeks. And it's what was called a triple-blind crossover design. So the person giving the supplement didn't know what it was. The people evaluating the horses didn't know what it was. And it was a crossover design so that they started with either the science supplement product S, or they had the placebo first, one or the other. And then after a washout period, they received the other treatment. And horses were evaluated at day 0, that's baseline, day 21 after the first treatment, and day 42 after the second treatment. And let's look at the results on the next slide, please. And they were able to demonstrate that those horses who received the supplement had significantly lower lameness in a straight line or in a circle compared with those with either the baseline or the placebo. So there did seem to be a measurable improvement in gait characteristics with the supplement. But it was interesting that there was improved range of motion of the back and muscle tone over the period of the study for horses receiving either of the supplement or the placebo. The handlers of the horses were also asked to grade how cooperative and willing the horses were, them not knowing whether or not the horse was on the supplement or the placebo. And the handler scores and the ease of movement scores were both better for supplement S compared with either the placebo or the baseline. Next slide, please. So this seems to indicate to us that although these assessments were all subjective, there were no measurements of the horse's movement acquired, and it was only a short-term study, that there was a positive benefit for using supplement S. So this is the only study that has been done from a scientific perspective that has demonstrated a positive effect of any of the supplements. So when going back to my original questions, I would always say, well, why do you want to use a supplement? If your horse is a healthy horse, I don't think we've got any evidence to demonstrate that the use of a supplement may be of any benefit to the horse whatsoever. We have no evidence at all that these are in any way protective for joints. The next area that we wanted to look at was so-called acoustic ear covers. And these have become extremely popular, fashionable, ubiquitous in some instances. And there are some astounding marketing claims. So to give you some examples, they decrease sharp sounds and improve your horse's relaxation and concentration with this peak performance acoustic hood. When the horse's hearing is reduced, they depend more on the rider for direction in terms of touch and listening to other aids. Improves focus, reduces fatigue, and enhances energy. Protects your horse's ears due to the soundproof fabric, 100% polyester. Let's think about what soundproofing actually means. Let's go to the next slide. The Oxford English Dictionary defines soundproofing as meaning preventing or constructed of material that prevents the passage of sound. So we have to ask, do any ear covers obliterate all sound? Have the materials used in the construction of the ear covers been tested for their ability to limit the passage of sound? And then quite an important question. We know that horses can hear ultrasonic sounds, which are way above the frequency of sound that we can hear. So is any sound reduction that actually takes place influenced by the frequency of sound? And several of the manufacturers claim that they reduce sharp noise or sound. What is meant by sharp noise or sound? And is there any evidence, other than anecdotal reports from riders, that ridden horse behaviour is actually influenced by the use of these so-called acoustic ears? There has been a study performed in the United Kingdom, if we go to the next slide, and this was done by Claire Hole, Rachel Murray and David Marlin. And they investigated the use of a single manufacturer's noise damping ear covers. And they did this by having the horses in a large stable, facing the back of the stable, so they weren't distracted by things going on outside. And they measured the horses' heart rates at baseline and behavioural responses, for example, moving the head, fidgeting. And they then played the horses various different noises. And these comprised trotting, hand clapping and cheering, so representing applause, a horse whinnying, some music, and that was We Are the Champions by Queen, which is often used in prize givings, and the sound of food going into a plastic bucket. And the horses were evaluated both without and with the noise damping ear covers. Let's go to the next slide. All the sounds provoked a significant increase in the peak heart rate compared with the resting heart rate. The peak heart rate for trot was higher than that for the other sounds. So it seems that the horses were able to differentiate among the sounds. So those were the peak heart rates. The average heart rate increased for not just trotting, but also for the feed sound and the whinny. There were variable behavioural responses. So let's look at the effects of the ear covers. So when all the different sounds were analysed together, there was a decrease in the average heart rate when comparing with ear covers to without ear covers. So it appeared that heart rate was influenced by the presence of the ear covers. But there was only a significant difference, that is from a statistical point of view, for the average heart rate for the sound of food and not for the other sounds. And when we look at the exhibition of various behaviours, the total frequency of behaviours comparing ear covers and no ear covers was significantly different for trotting, applause, and feed. So without the ear covers, there were more behavioural responses for each of those three sounds, for the trotting, the applause, and the feed. So it does appear that the ear covers can influence the horse's perception of some of the sounds that were used. Let's go to the next slide, please. But we have to, I think, then ask what happens in the real world when horses are exposed to a large range of environmental stimuli. Does it really influence their behaviours under those circumstances? And we don't have any answers about that. And then I think one relevant question to ask, if we go to the next slide, is are there any downsides to using ear covers? And Dr. David Marlin did do a survey amongst users of a variety of different acoustic ear covers, and a number of them commented that if a horse shook its head, the bridle and the ear covers fell off, which obviously is not a very user-friendly circumstance. Dressage stewards have commented that when they've been doing after competition checks, that there have been undue sweating under ear covers. I think it's really important to recognise that obviously these ear covers take up space. So if a bridle fits optimally without ear covers, it is likely to create potential excess pressure underneath bits of the bridle with the ear covers in place. We also have to recognise that most manufacturers' ear covers come in three sizes: pony, cob, and horse. And three sizes do not fit all of the ear shapes and head sizes, so they don't necessarily fit optimally, which may be one of the reasons why some horses will shake the head and the bridle and the ear covers will come off. Let's just consider if the study had limitations. Let's go to the next slide, please. So with respect to this current study, they only use one manufacturer's ear covers. So we don't know if those results are in any way applicable to other ear covers. And we have to ask the question, is the effect of these tested ear covers the result of sound attenuation, or could it be due to white noise created by the materials against the horse's ear? And we don't know the answer to that. We also don't know if the volume of sound would be effectively altering the results. And as I intimated previously, they only tested sounds within the human auditory range. So we don't know anything about the ability of the tested ears to attenuate ultrasonic sound. And one other question that we have to ask is, if the sound was reduced in volume and the direction of the sound is less obvious from the source point of view, could this potentially provoke anxiety in the horse? And again, we don't know the answer with respect to that. Let's go to the next slide. What we do know is, rather like the half pads that I described to you before, there is a huge range of products and prices. So there's one available for £129, that's euros 147, $172. Soundproof ear bonnet, comfy neoprene that covers and lines their ears. They not only help soothe, dampen and absorb ambient noise and improve focus and concentration, but... And then there's one for £19.95, €23, $27. Features a soft opren material on the ears. It helps to dampen noise, perfect for spooky or sensitive horses. So what's the answer? I think we don't know. So let's go to the final slide. And I guess these are my take-home messages. The buyer should be beware. And what risk do you want to take in terms of spending your money? You certainly don't want to break a stirrup, as seen in the image on the right. Is the product value for money? Do the claims stand up to careful scrutiny? Look carefully at the claims. And if you do buy something, try and monitor your horse's behavior and performance before and afterwards, so you can more objectively advise your friends or your clients as to what is or is not effective. I guess it's been a little bit provocative. As I said, we're not trying to either endorse any products or denigrate any products. We're just trying to make you think about what you use, why you use it, and whether or not it may or may not be effective, and to be critical about what manufacturers claim. Jodie, have you got any comments? You're a user, your clients are users.
Yeah, I do have a lot of thoughts. It strikes me because, it is somewhat controversial, and I think that has to do with the fact that there's this dichotomy of the horse world tends to be very traditional and resistant to change, and this is one area where there are innovations happening, and I think it makes it very appealing to engage with some of these products that make these claims. And I think, the takeaway is that it's very hard to know. And do you have any advice for people if they are looking for evidence, or just aside from the people that they can talk to, if they're looking to do research on their own, where would you start as a layperson doing research?
I mean, you can always go to Google search, and in Google search, you can put in a subject which will bring up some scientific papers, and you can generally get access at least to the summary of the paper, which will give you an overview of what is there. And that's a fairly reliable source, but you might have to trawl through a lot of unrelated junk that is not particularly helpful.
Yeah, that's what's so helpful about this background is I think you outlined a way to be skeptical but not dismiss what might be valuable information.
Yeah, and one of the problems is that if you look at research, as I've tried to demonstrate today, you can get two completely different results as they did for the half pads, but that probably relates to the experimental design. And you have to know enough about experimental design to tease out what is a reasonable conclusion and what isn't.
Yeah,
or how effectiveness can be masked by the way in which the study was performed.
I feel like you've outlined that in several of our talks. I think back to when we talked about bits and bitless bridles, and you explained how difficult it would be to do an ethical, statistically significant study on some of these bridles. And then the other aspect to that, which I think most people are aware of, is that you have to have money to do this research. And if the money is coming from the people trying to sell the product, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's invalidated. I think you've talked about an ulcer supplement that was developed by someone who, has done a ton of really good research that, is probably something that people can count on. So it doesn't necessarily mean that it's not useful, but it's really important to realize that I think from listening to you, my impression is that the majority of this evidence-based data that we have about a lot of these things comes from the companies that are actually selling the products.
Yes, I mean, I think if you look, for example, at the work that was done with so-called anatomical bridles, that was supported by the company that was one of the first leaders in the production of anatomical bridles. And I'm not knocking their research, because I think they tried to do it in a very ethical way to try and support their observations. And I would applaud them for doing that. But you also have to bear in mind that for their studies on the anatomical bridles and the anatomical girths, they were only one-off experiments. So they showed differences on one single day. One doesn't know if those differences would be sustained over a prolonged period of time. But that all boils down to the economics of performing any such study.
Right. Yeah, and it strikes me also that, this is something that comes up for me a lot working in the training and behavior field, is that behavior is the study of one. And I think we all know that something that works for one horse is not necessarily going to work for another horse. And so I think an important point to hit is that we do have really powerful tools for evaluating your own horse, including the 24 behaviors Ridden Horse Pain Ethogram, and then the additional behaviors that we have as a free download on our website. There's, I can't remember the exact number, but there's dozens of other behaviors that you can track for your own horse and see if you want to see, like, do I need to make a change if I see a number of these behaviors, and if I make a change, do those behaviors improve? And those are things that you can objectively measure and track to keep track of the choices you're making. And then the other thing that strikes me is, considering the source. If you're taking the information from the company that's selling the product, you definitely need to be skeptical. But also, I do see a lot of my clients making decisions based on either on people that they follow on social media and their advice, or on my advice, or on their veterinarian's advice. And I think those can all be really good resources, because I think social media has done a lot of good things in terms of exposing ineffective practices and giving exposure to some things that create better welfare for horses. But you do have to really consider the source. And to plug our next live that we're going to do, we talk a lot about having a team of people, because I think you can't count on any one person to know everything. If you're asking your vet about nutrition, your vet may or may not have gotten a lot of education in nutrition, and may not be up on the latest information in nutrition. And so there are people out there that do have expertise in that field. And your trainer is probably going to have more information about equipment than your friend on social media that does a different discipline. And so I think we'll be talking about all of those aspects of a team approach to welfare that I think really apply here when you're trying to make these choices. I think crowdsourcing information is really useful, but you need to really know what people what their strengths and weaknesses are.
Absolutely. I think that was a very good commentary. Thank you.
So I'm back from behind the scenes now, and I didn't have any questions pop up on the feed that I can see, but if you do have questions following this, go ahead and pop them in the comments there, and we will take the time to address those. I wanted to bounce back one slide. We put this up after our last live, and just wanted to call attention to it again. Dr. Sue and Kath Lauritsen of Padma Video put together last year, was it, Dr. Sue?
Yeah.
That the Horses and the Science of Harmony film came out. And Padma Video has now been releasing bonus footage that is just as engaging, just as intriguing. There's so much great information there. So the most recent bonus footage that came out a few weeks ago is specifically about horses and the science of acoustic ear covers. And Dr. Dyson did such a great job discussing this today, and there's even more discussion about this from various individuals. So check out that footage if you are interested. And then, as Jody was saying, our next live will be coming up next month, and we're going to be talking about how we can all communicate better for the benefit of horses, and how we can take a team approach, and a concept that maybe isn't always as successful or as commonplace, or just sort of seen as the default way of operating in the horse business. So we're going to talk about that next time. Dr. Dyson has again partnered with Horses Inside Out, and they are going to have this course that started last year, but there are some additions to this course, and doing this again. Dr. Dyson, did you want to talk about this real quickly?
Well, it's just a very good course, I think, to enhance your ability to look at horses, to differentiate between a variety of different gait abnormalities, and to test your ability to identify the 24 behaviors of the ridden horse in pain. So it comprises 2 introductory webinars, and then a series of video recordings which you can watch and make your own assessments from, and then watch and hear my commentary on. And then there's a final wrap-up webinar at the end where we address people's questions that have arisen during the course. It's fun to do, I think.
I will second that, because I took the first round and it was really, really valuable.
Great. And then just going to wrap up here. We want to thank everybody. We received generous donations over the holidays, and it really helps us put together more of the offerings that we have for free. We're very excited about some projects that we're working on to help continue bringing evidence-based horse training and care information to everyone. So if you like what we're doing and you want to support our work, you can donate to us at trainwithtrustproject.org. You can go to 24horsebehaviors.org and find the links as well, and on both websites you'll find our free resources. So wanted to thank everyone for joining us, and we will look forward to seeing everybody again next time around. And we will be talking about communication. So we look forward to seeing how we can build greater community for the benefit of horses. And hope you'll join us. Thanks again to Dr. Dyson for, again, bringing your wealth of knowledge to everyone in such a generous fashion.
You're welcome.